and welcome to our Twitch Q&A. We're talking about Realms of Pugmire with developer, designer, and all-around dog person, Eddy Webb.
I am all dog person. I'm made entirely of dog.
I mean, aren't you four pugs in a trench coat?
I like what you was three pugs, but I like
You're
how I've
taller
gotten
than me,
promotions
so I
before.
feel like
Yes.
you need an extra pug.
Oh, that makes
'Cause I
sense.
feel like
That's
I could
fair.
be three pugs in a trench coat.
That's fair. That's fair. So that is the unit of measure now is a pug.
Yeah, it's kind of like how you use hands for horses. We're gonna use pugs for people from now on.
There you
So
go.
I am not 5 feet tall anymore. I am three pugs high.
1,000% behind this.
So obviously this is a Q&A mostly for audience people. So Eddie and I will talk a little bit about the upcoming Realms of Pugmire book. We'll talk about the upcoming crowdfunding campaign. But at any point, please drop questions because that's really what we're here for, is to answer fan questions.
Yep.
More than we are to just talk about it. If you want to hear a deep dive on Realms of Pugmire, the second edition of Pugmire that's coming out soon, well, coming to crowdfunding soon, we did an Onyx Path cast on it recently. And we'll be talking about it probably for the next month, honestly.
Yeah, you can hear a lot about it, but certainly if you have specific questions, that's definitely kind of what we're here for. And if you're new to it, feel free to ask questions. If you're a longtime fan, I'm here to answer whatever questions you got. Maybe even non-Pugmire related questions, depending on how I'm feeling.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we're gonna be here for a couple hours, I think. So it'll be fun. We're gonna hang out. I've got my coffee. I've got my requisite 3 drinks, and that I have a soda, a coffee, and a water.
Yeah, are you gonna share all the drinks?
No, they're mine.
I meant like show us the drinks,
Oh,
not
I
like,
mean, I can, I can. I have a Ghoul Friend mug,
ooh, nice.
which I got at Halloween because I always go to Home Goods the day after Halloween and buy all their shit that's half off.
Mhm.
I have my soda in my little reusable cup because I am a good person, and also I have a soda stream, and
Mm,
I have my water in my big water bottle that I try to drink
nice.
2 of a day.
And I like the orange theme throughout.
Yeah, I mean, I bought an orange car, and then it like became a thing where like everything I own is orange now because the cups had to match my car. So when I take my
Right.
cup to my car, it looks good. I mean, I've got orange earbuds. Like
Wow.
it's a thing. I don't know what happened. I even have notes about Pugmire 2E on orange sticky notes.
Nice. And I mean, it helps that orange is a complementary color to green too. So
I like secondary colors. I like orange and purple and green. So yeah,
because you're a super villain.
yeah. And also my hair is super faded. So enjoy that, folks. While it lasts. I'm very blonde up top right now. That said, we have a couple of questions already. So let's go ahead and do that.
Yeah, sure.
Nicholas wants to know what pets will be playable in this edition. They know that there's dogs, cats, birds, and mice in general in Pugmire.
Hmm.
So what are we doing for the first book?
So that's a good question because it's a slightly complicated answer.
Mm-hmm.
So in this edition, we're only going to have one core rule book, and that is Realms of Pugmire. We're not doing different core rule books. That there's a lot of reasons for that. But the kind of short answer is when we did Monarchies of Mao as a core rule book, everyone kind of treated it like it was a source book. And so we're going to kind of restructure with that in mind, and also to make it a little easier to actually add more playable options in because we found trying to do that and bridging two core rule books turned out to be just not as great as we had hoped. So that being said, the core rule book is going to be primarily focused on dogs. I mean, it is ultimately Pugmire is a dog game.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of where its central point is. Uh, but there is going to be an appendix in the back that will allow you to play cats, mice, and rats out of the box. They're not going to be as full featured as
Mm-hmm.
they were in first edition and what they'll be in second edition. But it allows you to emulate them using the dog rules. So you can start with that because that's something we got a lot of the first time around.
Right.
So I want to make sure that people had an option to at least get started on those.
Mm-hmm.
Then from there, we're going to have 3 players guides for Pugmire. Dogs of Pugmire, but we're also going to have cats of Pugmire and rodents of Pugmire. And the cats and rodents of Pugmire will have the actual full featured rules for character creation for those.
Mm-hmm.
And then after those or around those, I mean, the actual order is still being debated. We're going to have Chronicle books that will give you like lots of information about an area, give you some adventures to play in that area, and also give you character creation rules for other species on top of that. So if there was a species that had a playable option in 1E, it will eventually we'll get around to it in 2E. So reptiles are going to be there, birds are going to be there,
Mhm.
so on and so forth.
Uh,
We are going to look at other ones as well. That's kind of a little further down the road. But the short answer is that I know that cat people in particular want to make sure they play cats right out of the gate. So
mhm.
I'll make sure that at least cat and rodent people had a chance to play something immediately.
Yeah, I think that those are kind of the big three pets. I think
Right.
and like if you have rules for mice and you really want to play a gerbil, that's fine. Just make it gerbil of mouse. Like it's not a big deal.
And that's actually a note I do have in the appendix is that part of the reason why I did it this way is that it will allow people to be able to look at it and go, okay, I see what the logic is here.
Mhm.
I can then use these core books to emulate any other kind of species that I think is interesting, doing a little bit of work. So, oh, this maps up to this, maps up to that. Again, it's not going to be as full featured, but if people really want to, like I said, play a gerbil, they can look at how we emulated mice and rats and go, okay, maybe I'll change this versus that and put it out there.
Yeah, I've kind of joked that it's totally doable. That if you mix the rules for mice and birds, you could make a bat really easily.
Oh, yeah.
Like just give them the sparrow flight, so they can actually have a little bit of flight powers, and then
Mm-hmm.
give them like some mouse abilities. Because there's a reason in German they're called Die Fledermaus, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like it makes sense. So yeah, you can do all kinds of stuff with it. Now, are there any new pets you're gonna add this edition that haven't been playable in previous ones that you're thinking about?
Um, uh, Moving outside of the core rulebook, things obviously get a little more nebulous because we haven't started those books yet. So it's
Mm,
kind of where I think is going to happen versus what may actually happen. But right now, we're definitely looking at birds and lizards,
mm-hmm,
and those will probably be broken down into the chronicle books, like I said. I am also very likely going to do the badger tribes.
mm-hmm,
So that's badgers, weasels, ferrets, what have you. I think those will probably happen. Obviously, we're still working on the Squeaks companion, so that's going to have rabbits in it.
mm-hmm.
Odds are pretty good that at some point in time they'll have a 2B makeover as well. Um, and then we'll see from there. I generally have always been kind of slow to add new species, and there's a couple of reasons for that. On the one hand, I don't want every time I do a new thing, oh, here's the next animal
Mm-hmm.
person you can play out the door. Uh, but also, it's always been about emulating animals that humans have a close connection to and
Mm-hmm.
pets. Granted, humans will make a pet out of anything. That's something I've increasingly learned over the past 5 years. It's like, what about this? What about this? I didn't, you can make pets of that, but sure, okay. So I am trying to focus really more on what culturally we consider to be pets.
Mm-hmm.
So dogs and cats are very high because we consider those pets for since antiquity.
Right.
Mice and rats, a little more nebulous, but also we have coexisted with mice and rats in our lives, whether they're pets or not. There's still a relationship there. So, and also a lot of animal stories feature mice and rats as protagonists or antagonists.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why they're kind of in the top three of the triangle, if you will. But when you start getting into birds and lizards, there's lots of people who have them, but they're
Mm-hmm.
not as kind of culturally connected to them. And even the badger tribes are kind of an outlier, but I wanted to have a space for, okay, here's something that's, if you don't want to play something that's outside of this scope, you can. Here's one area you can do it in, and a chance to kind of, again, look to pull that apart and emulate other unusual options if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not super keen on always just adding new pets. And I get it. Everyone's like, I'll play this. I'll play this. I want to add this thing to my game. And it's like that's cool, but that's not always necessarily what I'm keen to support. I want to make sure that there's a foundation there, and then we're always building on that foundation rather than just trotting out the next species in order to get a few more bucks.
Right. And I assume that we're going to, I mean, still have Canis Minor going on. So if people
Absolutely,
really
yeah,
want to make rules for your pet tarantula, go for it. I will not
right,
come into your house if you have a pet tarantula.
right.
But that's me. Yes, I know they're harmless. No, no one needs to educate me. But yeah, like I've joked for years about making a book featuring just my three favorite animals, which are bats, hedgehogs, and penguins.
Right, yeah.
Just for the hell of it. Like, why not? We'll have Arctic explorer penguins and
No,
all
totally.
kinds of cool stuff.
And I think again, I mean, I think those options are cool, but the strength of Pugmire as a game has
Mhm.
been always kind of a fantasy game with dogs, fantasy
Right.
game with cats. And the more you add to that, I mean, if you want to play a game with penguins, that's great, but that starts to dilute the core strength of the game.
Hmm.
So that's why I would much rather absolutely y'all do community content and put it out there and make a few bucks even with community content program of like, sell it to other people who are also super interested in making those rules. But
Yeah,
fantastic. I highly support that. But I want to make sure that I'm really kind of focused on the core elements of it and get a chance to kind of really build those out.
totally. Yeah. I mean, it's good to have a focus when you go into something like this because if you're
Yep.
just like, I'm gonna make every animal here, then that's not there's not a game there. You're just creating new, you know, species.
Right. I mean, at that point in time, you're getting into kind of like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle territory of like roll on this table from one out of 100 animals, and I'm playing up with the octopus, and you're playing an elephant, and he's playing a rhinoceros. Thing. That's cool. I'm not saying it's a bad game. I'm saying it's not the game I'm making.
Right, right. Now I want to play an octopus. Damn. You
Well,
give
I
me so
mean,
many
Eclipse Phase
ideas.
has you covered on that. Don't worry.
True, 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 true. Um, Mikhail wanted to know if there's any specific part of the setting that you didn't get to delve much into in 1E that you're looking forward to expanding in Realms of Pugmire.
Honestly, that's kind of an interesting question because when I first did Pugmire, I mean, on the one hand, I wasn't sure I was doing more than one book.
Mm-hmm.
I've been pretty open about that. Like when we did the Kickstarter, I'm going to do this one book. Let's get this game out there. Maybe do a couple stretch goals, call it a day. Particularly because I had seen Rose do Cavaliers of Mars. That's kind of how it planned out. And it's like, okay, well, maybe that's all I'm doing. So I wanted to kind of give enough structure there so that people could sketch out and have fun building out things on their own. And
Mm-hmm.
then, here we are 6 or 7 years later, and we had a few books out there. So some of the things that I sketched out, I got a chance to delve into, and some of the stuff I didn't. So for me, I think one of the big areas that I surprisingly never got around to are the dog towns near Pugmire.
Mm-hmm.
We did Water Dog Port in Pirates of Pugmire. I've never really touched on Houndtown. I never really touched on Mutttown. And those are two kind of noteworthy characters in the political structure of Pugmire. That's actually kind of where the realms idea came from. Like Pugmire was at one point an empire,
Right.
and now they're those all the cities have kind of spun off and done their own thing. So it's a fading empire, but still, I mean, that's where the realms are. It's more than just as one kingdom. And there have been rumors of villages up to the north. There's been some fiction of stuff even further past the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
So getting a chance to get into the dog settlements in future books is something I'm really excited about.
Yeah, it's funny because one of the adventures in the Curious Cats book that I developed uh, has a big set piece in Houndton. So in my
Mhm.
brain, Houndton's been kind of fleshed out, but then I'm like, not everybody has read that. Like that's like the
Right.
one adventure that I've run that takes place there. But yeah, no, it's not a hugely detailed out piece right now.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like what I sketched out is very evocative, and I think lots of
Mm-hmm.
people have taken more or less, like I said with adventure, like they've kind of pulled more or less what I expected out of it, which is great.
Right.
But you're right, it's a few paragraphs and some other side references, so it's really just more a collective hallucination of what Houndson really is, as opposed to actually going, oh, okay, here's different places. Like
Right.
I've done a few playtest adventures and a couple of streams now in Houndton, particularly with things like Castle Transylvania Hounds. And there's a bar I've used Houndton a few times. So in my head, it's actually pretty well fleshed out. But yeah, it's just not been down anywhere officially.
Mm-hmm.
And Mutttown, I used it in the interactive novel I wrote.
Right.
You see a bit of Mutttown there. And again, I have a pretty strong idea of what it looks like and what happens there, but I've never actually written it down. And I think that's kind of a good example of what this new edition is really about. Again, the first edition was here's a book, here's another book, here's another book. So it kind of was melt serially.
Mm-hmm.
This is now where I can actually plan out 7 days.
Right. That's cool. That will be exciting just to see maybe some new places and get more details on some other places.
Yep.
That's super super useful. Once again, people can put any questions in here. Obviously, I have to scroll back. The Onyx Path wants to know where are my rules for uplifted pet rocks, Eddie.
Never. You're never getting them, Ian. I'm sorry. Nice try.
Yeah, it's actually funny because when Ian posted that in the chat, I was thinking that because you had just said people will make pets out of anything, and I was
Right.
like, sentient pet rock. Everything Everywhere All at Once had Rox's characters. I could probably do this. Like,
I really need to watch that, honestly.
it's so good. It's so good. It's so good.
I've heard good things.
Everybody watch that movie after the stream. Just at 3 o'clock my time, go and watch Everything Everywhere All at Once. Uh, Especially if you like multiverse shenanigans.
Yeah, I've heard.
But yeah, I guess is there an actual play happening this weekend? It looks like for a playtest.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics offhand, but I do know that there's some folks here on the Onyx Path Twitch who have been doing an actual play every Friday, Saturday, I want to say.
Yeah, it's Saturday at 4, according
Yeah.
to the chat.
Yeah. So I haven't get a chance to watch it, but I've heard really good things. Like I said, it's mentioned in chat that it's set in Houndton, and they've been using an older draft of the playtest rules to kind of really show it off, which has been fantastic. I'm really glad that people are getting a chance to playtest it and show it off. That
Yeah.
means the world to me to get people excited about it.
That's awesome. Samurai Mududu asked, "My group is champing at the bit to start playtesting Realms. How reasonable would it be to convert existing adventures to Realms and 2E?"
Pretty reasonable. I have written a conversion guide from first edition. Originally, it was going to be in the book. Now we're going to have it as a separate product frankly for legal reasons, because we have to reference SRD and OGL related material for the conversion to work. So we have to kind of get outside the book to divest ourselves of the OGL license. But really, this is just an evolution. It's not a whole new system. It is just an evolution of what happened before. So last time I checked, the conversion document was like 4 or 5 pages long in Word. And a fair amount of that is just things like, if you're looking for this spell, it's now here, kind of stuff. I have to do some more work on it because I'm obviously revising the manuscript, and then I'll revise the conversion guide accordingly. And we're looking at probably making that free through the Kickstarter, maybe even outside the Kickstarter. We're still kind of looking into the solutions for that. But that'll probably be like a free little PDF jobby where you can download it and just kind of go, okay, here's how to convert first edition stuff, second edition.
Yeah, totally. Is it going to be out at all around the time of the crowdfunding campaign, or is it going to be released with the book?
Right now, probably near the end of the crowdfunding campaign.
Okay. Just because people are champing at the bit to play, like right now.
Right, yeah, so. Yeah. So I'm going to try to make that happen. We'll see how it goes.
Very cool. Very cool. Sorry, I'm trying to do all this.
That's fine.
Do the main characters of Pugmire fight each other a lot, or is it more outside enemies?
It's more outside enemies. So a lot of the game is about exploration. When at the start of the book, I break down theme and mood, which are pretty common if you play most Onyx Path books.
Yeah.
But as opposed to the third option I have is what I call action, and action is basically what characters do. Because it's something that I think a lot of games could stand to do better. Is like, what do you do in this game?
Yeah, totally.
And so a lot of it is exploring strange areas and kind of reclaiming the world. So a lot of the threats you're going to find there are going to be external. There are kind of bespoke monsters throughout the world. That's pretty common for fantasy games, so that's not a huge surprise here. But one thing that the dogs, particularly actually all species, have some kind of antagonistic relationship with is a group of demons called collectively the Unseen.
Right.
And the Unseen are basically they were invisible monsters that had some dogs blame for the humanity leaving. Other dogs are a little kind of unclear about it, but it's something that a lot of dogs believe existed before, and that humanity had a bad with, and dogs tried to warn humanity about the coming of the Unseen, and humanity didn't listen or couldn't listen or whatever. And so now a lot of dogs feel like they have to kind of approach and deal with this threat. So that's a common thread through a lot of Pugmire material. There are politics, certainly. The cat monarchies are a little more structured to be political and potentially light PvP, as it were. If you really want to explore that, dogs have enough politics to dig into if you really want to have that for dogs too. All the species I felt like needed to have a very clear path of I want to have politics or I want to all be friends. So I've tried to make sure all of those paths are available. But we're definitely not looking on the level of, like, say, a World of Darkness game.
Right.
This is at worst, you're looking at maybe rival factions of NPC dogs that are coming after you,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe you're a dog and you're antagonistic against cats because of conflicts in the past. There was actually a war between dogs and cats in the history of the world.
Right.
So you have a lot of options there. But in terms of just the kind of sit down and play everything by the book, don't dig too deep behind the surface, most of your enemies are going to be external.
Right. And as a side note, I think the reason you told me many years ago, the whole thing about the unseen is that that's the reason that cats and dogs in our timeline bark at nothing or stare in the
Yeah,
corners
yeah,
or whatever. Like, I have a cat that constantly wants to leap up next to a vent on their cat tree and just like look in the vent, and I'm like, what's in that vent? I don't like it. Like,
demons.
yeah, clearly demons. So yeah, whenever you see a dog barking at nothing, you are near a demon. Be scared.
Exactly.
We're going to get quite a few questions, so I'm pausing the
Good.
chat, so I will catch up as I do.
Okay.
Um, oh my gosh. I don't know. Chomic Litwin says, will monarchies of Mal 2e have politics rules like birthright for D&D? And will monarchies be a supplement rather than a core book for 2e?
Yeah, so what was in Monarchies of Mao is actually going to be divided across two books. The
Mm-hmm.
first is the Cats of Pugmire, which is basically the player's guide, and it's going to be mostly just the cat character creation rules, a little bit of information about cats, but it's going to be really more focused on cats in Pugmire. So
Mm-hmm.
if you want to get the Pugmire core rule book and then get the Cats of Pugmire book, the default assumption is that you're playing cats around dogs, and so the material will be kind of relating to that. Um, then there will be a separate Monarchies Mount book, and that's going to be more of a campaign style book. So it's going to be a lot more setting information,
Mm-hmm.
maybe some character creation rules for a new species. Currently, I'm looking at birds. We'll see how that pans out, and then some adventures in there as well. Some people have mentioned about doing kind of political rules in Monarchy's source book, and it makes sense to kind of put some
Mm-hmm.
in there. I don't know if that's going to happen or not. I mean, we'll have to see kind of when I get there, that book. But it's not going to be like, if you're familiar with Birthright. Birthright, for those of you who don't know, is a D&D second edition setting that was much more about kingdom building.
Yeah.
So there's lots of like, okay, I make this decision, and then a year goes by, and we see the results of that decision. It's probably not going to be anything like that because
Okay.
it's just not this style of game. But I can see room for things like expanded social rules, how to have social combat in things like parties and
Mm-hmm.
conflicts and debates and the like. So I think there's probably potential room for something like that, but not on a kind of kingdom building scale.
Yeah, I mean, if as always, if your table wants to say like, okay, we're gonna skip forward 2 years and see if this
Oh, sure,
project has
yeah,
gone into effect, go for it. We're not gonna stop you. We're
right,
not gonna have like bespoke rules for that. So
right, yeah, yeah.
awesome. Somebody has asked the question. Kiram's asked, can you talk a little about the system as you're moving away from OGL?
There's not I mean, that is both a very simple and very hard question,
Right.
because it's like, talk about the system. Well, let me just explain everything I've changed. But I think it's easier to say it's not going to be that much different. If you
Mm-hmm.
played first edition, you pick up second edition, it's not going to be a completely different game at all. It is a natural evolution of the first edition game. So you're still rolling a d20. You're still rolling various polyhedral dice for damage. You still have a bonus that you add depending on what level you are. You still have abilities that modified him a lot. So a lot of it is refinements of that system.
Mm-hmm.
It's just I have refined it in ways that take it further away from its Dungeons and Dragon roots. So as example, the abilities, which are now attributes, originally they had a score from 3 to 18, and then from there you got a modifier. The score doesn't do anything. It really never has, or at least not in the past couple iterations of D&D. So I just dropped it. So now your abilities range from -3 to +5.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a much clearer. It's okay, my strength is +2, so I roll d20 and add +2.
Right.
It's a very simple number to sort out. Money is still abstract in this game, so it's much more about, I have some money, I have a lot of money, I have no money. I made that a little clearer, and then hopefully there'll be space in the character sheet for that.
Yeah, it's like a track now, right?
Right, yeah, what I'm calling the plastic track. So that way that could be kind of followed a little more clearly.
Right.
Um, there are some adjustments some things that used to be worked one way and work slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
Just a few days ago, I've been adjusting kind of how death saves work, because they're not called death saves anymore,
Right.
but they work a little differently. Partially because I had been calling them death saves. People assume they work like they did in 5e, and they don't. So it's a good opportunity to actually take this chance, and I'm moving away from OGL, to actually clearing up language that I felt originally needed to be there to make people make those connections better, to now, okay, it doesn't actually work this way, so let's stop calling it that.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's just a simple, you have to fail 3 saving throws,
Mm-hmm.
which I now call tests, 3 tests. And if you fail those tests, then you die. But if you make even one of them, then you're back,
Right.
as opposed to the 3 and 3 race condition that you have in Dungeons and Dragons.
Right. Totally. Um, I had a thought and it went like right out of my head as I was sitting here talking because that happens
Demons!
sometimes. Yeah, yeah, right. It was the demons. Yeah, we've been talking a lot about the OGL recently. We've talked about it a little bit on the podcast, talked about it a little
Yep.
bit. I know Rich has talked about it in the blog. So definitely like we have thoughts on it, and most of our thoughts are that it's not a huge deal for Onyx Path as a
Right.
company, which is great. Honestly, that makes our lives much easier that it's not that huge of a deal. Um, not to diminish what anybody else is going through having to deal with it, and not to
Right.
say that anybody's on the wrong for being freaked
Right.
out about it. Just saying that as far as for our business, it's not as big of a thing for the actual
Yeah.
business side of things.
Yeah. I think of it a lot like when COVID first hit in 2020, right? A lot of companies were like, oh my God, this is a huge deal because people aren't going into gaming stores and buying their books. And so it's similar in the sense that I'm not diminishing the fact that this may have a huge impact on a lot of publishers,
Right.
but in both cases, Onyx Path has been structured in a way where it actually minimizes the impact it has on us specifically.
Mm-hmm.
To be honest, the main reason why I was even considering keeping the OGL for second edition was for a sense of continuity.
Right.
So, for example, um, until all this happened, I really felt like the OGL had been like 22 years of established license. So it's like, yeah, why not? I'm really the mind of like, I might just keep throwing it in there,
Mm-hmm.
because there's no reason not to. Now that I have really good reasons not to. I'm cleaning things up more to reduce what is generally known as identifying language,
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that it's a little clearer that this is not meant to be D&D. But to be honest, that was something I have been wanting to do for a while anyway, because one thing that has been pretty consistent over the past few years of Pugmire is a lot of people come into it thinking it's completely 5e compliant
Right.
and expressing frustration when the game doesn't actually work the way they think it should, because it's not working exactly like 5e. It was never meant to be. It was meant to evoke and be similar to 5e. So
Right.
I feel like Pugsteady was a little too faithful to the 5e engine. And even internally at Onyx Path, we sometimes had discussions or confusions, because it kept being marketed like, oh, this is a 5e product. It's not. It isn't. It's actually a very different kind of product. It happens to use an engine that is similar to
Mm-hmm.
the 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. So in a way, I'm actually glad we're going this route, because now I can just make that as clear as possible on the page. This is going to feel like Dungeons and Dragons, which has always been my intent. But it's also going to feel like, British fantasy gaming in the 80s. It's going to feel like Tunnels and Trolls a little bit. It's going to feel like other fantasy games, that not just Dungeons and Dragons, that I'm trying to kind of connect to. So it's going to feel like a lot of older style fantasy games with a modern aesthetic to it.
Mm-hmm. I didn't remember what the thought I had earlier was.
Oh, yeah.
The only time I've ever had to reference my ability score in playing D&D, not playing anything else, is I think it's if you tie on an initiative roll,
Yes.
then you have to figure out who has the higher dex. But
Yep.
I think that in this position, A, if whoever has the higher bonus, B, just work it out at your table.
Right.
It's
And especially
someone's
because
going to go first.
actually, it's a perfect example is I have seen so many times people run Pugmire actual plays, and they'll go, okay, yeah, great, run Pugmire. And then they'll start doing D&D style initiative where everyone goes in a very specific
Right.
ladder. And it's like, no, it's popcorn initiative.
It's popcorn, yeah.
So lots of people are like, there's not much to do to modify initiative. It's like, there's not much reason to modify initiative.
Yeah, as long as you know who wins.
Right. All that matters is who goes first. That's the only thing you're rolling initiative for. It's for who goes first.
Yeah, and then just keeping track of who has gone every round,
Yep.
But yeah, no, that's all I was thinking of, because whenever you were like, you never reference it, I was like, I have to reference deck sometimes. Why? It's
Right.
It's that reason.
I think there's also some spells like where You have to overcome the number of points of effect of the spell, overcomes their score. So, I mean, there are certainly edge cases,
Yeah,
but nearly all of those edge cases can be written around. And I
exactly.
did.
Exactly. Exactly. So to put the edge case people at ease.
Yes, yes.
Kind of a long one here, but I think it's a really, really good question. I'm going to
Okay.
read the whole thing. Um, Good Ascenders asked, for a post-apocalyptic setting with humankind gone, I've always found Pugmire more on the adventure time side of things, where what happened
Hmm.
before influences the world but isn't like an active threat, as opposed to like Horizon Zero Dawn, right?
Yep.
They find that distance part of the game's charm personally, but no others would like humanity show up more in Pugmire. What can we expect in that sense from the core, as far as like how heavy-handed are we with talking about humanity or the old ones and their influence?
It's going to be about the same. I actually initially kind of edged even further away,
Mm-hmm.
but recognizing that some people wanted that, I ultimately recorrected back and ended up pretty much where I started. So kind of a nice big circle of design. Welcome to game design. Sometimes you design yourself right back to where you started. It happens.
Okay.
But I've always felt that man works best in Pugmire if it is mythological rather
Mm-hmm.
than literal. And I've had some questions of like, how do dogs not know what man looks like? Because one thing humans are really good at is depicting themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't make a ton of sense if you think about it hard. And the answer is because the game doesn't work if that is true. There's no logical reason for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's meant to be. I hand wave away by saying there's lots of confusing depictions of humanity.
Right.
And also, humanity makes a lot of assumptions in how it depicts itself that people without that cultural context may not have.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, and the way dogs and cats are uplifted, they look kind of like people. So you can look at something like a picture of a human and go, "That's a weird looking dog with no fur. That doesn't make sense," you know?
I am, in fact, one really strange, large, hairless cat.
Right? Yeah, or if you're wearing a trench coat, you're three pugs, as we established earlier.
Or
For
with the
those of you who
hair,
came
maybe
in
I'm like
late.
a bird. I don't know.
Yes. So I continue to have zero plans to tell you what happened to humanity or where they're at or what's happening because I want to leave that open. Some people have told me, that's great, but and they almost like ask my permission. It's like, is it okay if I run a game where they run into humans? Like, go for it.
Yeah.
Um,
We all have our own
one,
like headcanons about what happened to humanity because speculating on that is fun.
yeah. And in fact, I just recently added this to the inspirations, but I've been reading a comic called Autumn Lands,
Okay.
which is one of those comics that once I read, I was like, oh, this is perfect because it's like Pugmire. It's about a bunch of animals who have evolved. They've tried to reclaim a land,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the story. I won't spoil too much, but the story ultimately is they're trying to recover the so-called lost warrior,
Mm-hmm.
and each of the species like, oh, obviously it's a dog, no, it's a cat, no, it's an owl. Everyone's opinion of who the lost warrior is, and lost warrior turns out to be a human. And they're like, what are you? And then it turns out this whole fantasy world actually has a sci-fi explanation. So it's perfect for Pugmire.
That's so
And
cool.
I could totally see games where like someone gets into a weird time bubble or a cryo chamber and only she's one human. And they're just like, what are you? And
Yeah.
then they realize it's like, oh, you're our gods. And this human's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Why is this dog talking to me? Why is it praying to me? What is going on?
Yeah. Why are these dogs 5 feet tall and bipedal? I don't understand. Like,
Right. But the second I make any definitive statement on that,
uh,
then a whole bunch of options stop becoming available to players.
yep.
So I would much rather keep it as vague as possible because it doesn't matter if dogs or cats or rats or ever are right about humanity. That's not the point. The point is, what do they do with this information?
Mm-hmm.
Dogs ultimately said dogs see the best in us. They see humanity's benevolence, that humanity wants to do good, they want to do well by animals. And cats look at humanity and go, well, they screwed everything up and we have to fix this place. Whether you can argue whether each side is right or wrong, and they certainly argue about that. But the more important is like, how does that shape their culture? How does it shape their society? How does it shape how they interact with each other? That's the more interesting and relevant point. And answering that question shuts all that conversation down.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's like I scrolled down in the chat to see where people were, and everybody's talking about all the different things that could have happened.
Yeah.
Some of them are very silly. I like it's because of the rise of AI art in the late eras of the old ones. That's why we don't have pictures of humanity anymore. Um,
That's good. I like that one.
I also like Pugmire is an unofficial sequel to Trinity post Aeon.
Yes.
Humans died because instead of seats on their escape ships, they bought rare limited NFTs with pictures of those seats. Uh,
No, and certainly, Rose and I have joked that Cavaliers and Mars of Pugmire are in fact in the same universe, even though it's not entirely true, but also it's not true.
yeah, that's
So,
that's my favorite explanation is that at some point humanity fucked off to Mars, and then they
right,
forgot that technology somehow. Like it's not there anymore, so they can't get back.
right,
They can see it through like a telescope, and they can be like, "Hey, there's a planet. It looks cool,"
right.
but they have no idea.
Yeah.
Uh,
And the other kind of private reason is also I do have in the back of my head a semi-related project. I'm not going to talk anything about it except for just saying that I have another project.
ooh, secret
But
project.
I need this project to have a very vague answer for this other project to make sense and work. That's another reason why I'm keeping it vague. But that, frankly, that's more of a something that came into much later. I've always felt like all the stuff I did earlier is definitely the primary reason why I have it that way. But secondarily, it also helps out this other project if it goes anywhere. It may not. You may never see it. Who knows?
Yeah, just in the chat knows I don't even know what he's talking about. Like
Right.
we are in thought territory, not like
Yes.
working on it territory. Um,
This is thing I mentioned to Rich once in passing 3 years ago, and he may have already forgotten about it.
yeah. That's the problem with being a game designer is that you constantly have game ideas in your head. You're like, I
Yeah.
could make that game. I could make that game. And then sometimes you make them, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes they just
Yeah.
live in your head forever. All right, so we have a couple more questions going on. Thank you for all the questions, y'all. This is really helpful.
Yeah, it is.
Because otherwise I'm just sitting here vamping, and
Which
I
you
could
can
do that
do, but
for
you'd
a
rather
little
not.
bit. But yeah, I'd rather talk about Pugmire 2e. That's what we're here for.
Right.
Um, will the manuscript be released in its entirety or in larger chunks or the usual Onyx Path 2 chapters at a time when we do the crowdfund?
Oh, it'll definitely be in that latter category.
Yeah.
I know that the first time around we actually had an early access playable version slice. But then we didn't really release the whole manuscript until long after the campaign was over. So that had its advantages, disadvantages.
Mm-hmm.
But also Pugmire when he was in a very different place. I mean, like I didn't know if anyone was even going to buy into the concept, and so I had to get as much people excited about this thing actually worked. Because I mean, to take it back to 2016, I was regularly having to convince people it wasn't actually a joke that I had elaborate gag I had planned, that this is actually a real game I was making.
Well, yeah, because in 2015, 2016, you were the vampire guy. That's what people
Right,
knew you
exactly.
as, because you had just
Yeah,
done B20. And so, like, and also you had come from White Wolf and CCP. And so I think a lot of people thought of you as, like, a horror
right.
person and not other things.
Yes.
Interestingly, horror people can also like other things. It's weird.
What?
I have a skull and a bat on my desk, but I also have Sailor Moon action figures. Like, I can take
Yeah.
multitudes.
One of the paintings that we actually are shipping, we got a lot of our art, but one of the things we're shipping is that it's this beautiful painting. It is a picture of a pile of pugs and a pile of skulls, but the way the pugs and skulls are done, you can't quite tell which are which at a first glance. And I'm like, that's
Okay,
ideal.
I've not seen this. I want to see a picture of this at some point. That
I'll
sounds
have to see if
amazing.
I may have one on my phone. I'll have to dig up some
That
point. If
sounds
not, I'll certainly
amazing.
take a picture again. Yeah, it is. It's wonderful. Wonderful picture. I was like, this is our household in a nutshell.
Someday put it in the Discord. We just need to see it.
Yes, absolutely.
But yeah. Anyway, you were saying.
Oh yeah. So I mean, now we have a certain kind of established structure for these things, and James, who is our concierge, I think is the proper term,
Yeah.
for all of our crowdfunding campaigns.
Crowdfunding concierge.
Yes, he's really found that works out really well. It
Mm-hmm.
allows people to get things in bits and pieces as opposed to being overwhelmed by it at once. It allows us to have very kind of things specifically to talk about each time. So that's going to work really well. Obviously, I'm still in the middle of rewriting. That said, I'm almost done. I've only got a couple of chapters left I have to really work on. So there's a small chance we may get them slightly out of order, depending on how things go. But they will all be there. And
Mm-hmm.
again, like ideally near the end, we're still hammering out details right now, but ideally near the end of that, we'll also release some form of the conversion guide so people can see kind of at least where that's going.
Right. Yeah. Because that'll be helpful for people who want to like play around with it. Use the manuscript to do their early stuff, etc., etc. Like,
Right.
yeah. Because
And that I mean, eventually that'll have to be like everything else will have to be edited. It'll have to
yeah.
be
Oh
laid
yeah.
out. Probably won't be any art in it. It's just going to be kind of a kind of freebie thing, or maybe some pieces of art
Just
from the
like
book.
yeah,
Again,
just reuse smart from the core probably.
right. Is it not going to be that huge? But it'll be another kind of PDF, just words document.
Mm, cool. I'm excited. I had started to edit it, and then the OGL thing happened, as I'm sure everyone in the chat is aware of.
Right.
And it was, I think, the first time I've ever been told to cease editing.
Mm-hmm.
They were like, "No, give it back. We have to change stuff."
Yeah,
And it was way
yeah.
easier just to be like, "Just redo it, and I'll start over. It's fine. I'll just start over. I love editing Pugmire. I'd rather just normalize it from the beginning." But yeah, it's honestly, I think it's actually for the best that we're doing this. Like, I'm excited that the system's going to be what it is, and the terms are going to be what they are. We already pulled away so much from D&D terms by using things like fortune and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So might as well just pull the rest of the way away, you know?
And honestly, it gave me a chance to do some neat stuff. Like, for example, we haven't talked about it in this Q&A, but I've been talking about other places. Rich was so happy with Pugmire first edition. When I talked in second edition, one of the things he wanted to do is actually to extract that into what we're calling the Onyx 20 system that
Mm-hmm.
potentially could power other games using polyhedral dice as opposed to just D10s. He felt it was good to have a second house system in pocket, and it wouldn't require as much work as developing it completely from scratch. So it's like, why not use this as a basis for other potential games?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and since this kind of happens, I was able to do things like, okay, well, I can rename the attributes to mirror storyteller or story path attributes.
Mm-hmm.
So like strength is now might and wisdom is now cunning. So that way, when people who are playing story path pick this up, go, oh, I recognize some of these attributes. They work kind of the same way. Obviously, the dice are all different, but I mean, in terms of how this stuff, like fortune ultimately works a lot like momentum,
Mm-hmm.
so that's kind of where the inspiration came from. So it allowed me to kind of draw those connections a lot more tightly together and make it feel more like an Onyx Path system because it's going to share a lot of aesthetic DNA with Story Path.
Sorry, I was typing about how the chat got low build, which is a totally different thing. But
Oh,
yes, no, it's good to have a D20 system in place in general, just because like that is what a lot of people expect when they go to play a
right.
TTRPG. Just because that's what D&D has trained them to expect. Like,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
if you look at iconography for kind of general tabletop RPG spaces, you're
everything has a
almost always going to
D20.
see D20. Yep.
Everything.
Hmm.
It is so hard to find D10 merchandise in general. Like
Yeah.
I was always trying to find stuff when I was first here, trying to find like like a D10 T-shirt or something, and it's like no, everything's a freaking D20, and
Yep.
that's fine. It's fine. It's just not like that's not what we used for a long time, aside from in
Right.
Pugmire, pretty much.
And allows us to try new things. I mean, because like again, I mean, I love Storypath. I've been working in Storypath for a long time. I've even
Mm,
helped to kind of innovate some of the changes in it. I mean, so I'm really into Storypath. Don't get me wrong,
right.
but it's not perfect for everything. For the kind of Storypath is a different kind of action adventure than Onyx 20 will.
Mm-hmm.
And Pugmire is a different style of game. So it's not a case of oh well, you just have to suck it up and learn how to play different size D&D. It's like no, this is a way to kind of get your friends who are into D&D to go, okay, here's one that's a little more narrative,
Mm-hmm.
has a little more Onyx Path DNA. Do you like that? Oh, do you like these changes? Okay, well then now here's Story Path to kind of help you kind of make that next step. It can kind of act as a gateway into the bigger changes of Story Path
Mm-hmm.
because it won't seem so big.
Right. Yeah. Totally. And I mean, it's just like I said, it's just nice to have that system in place for any other game
Mm-hmm.
we might want to make with it.
Yep.
So yeah, so Josh asks or says you've mentioned, but I haven't heard a lot of details about how monsters or adversaries are going to be scaled in the new edition. Can you explain this more? I'm assuming they mean like challenge rating, things like that.
Oh yeah. So actually that's a great example of another place where I was able to actually change things because I originally had kept challenge rating as term,
Mm-hmm.
but I completely changed everything. So how Dungeons and Dragons math works, and I use works in quotes here, in the sense that the idea is a monster at a certain challenge rating works effective as an effective battle against four characters of the same level.
Right.
So a challenge rating 3 monster will be a good fight for 4 people who are level 3.
Right.
This breaks down for 2 big reasons. One, uh, if you have a mixed party of levels, that becomes a lot harder to dial in. You have to
Mm-hmm.
kind of add all the levels together and divide by 4 to get the actual effective challenge rating, which is not an intuitive way of balancing those.
No.
And 2, That doesn't actually work because when you get to challenge ratings 1 and 2, they're usually one-on-one anyway.
Hmm.
So you get this kind of weird thing where challenge ratings at the low ends are really more scaled to one-on-one combat. That's how they're used.
Hmm.
And then when you get challenge ratings at like 9 or 10, it's one versus a massive party. So it becomes kind of just a 1 to 10 scale of how difficult it is. It's how it's used in practice. So what I did is I actually recalculated the math so that way what's now a level, because I had to change the term. I just now call them monster levels. So now it's a level 1 monster versus, I guess, a level 1 character. And the idea is that they're all now 1 to 1. So if you have a level 10 character and you go against a level 10 monster, they should be a decent fight that either one could realistically win.
Hmm.
And that's been recalculated because basically what I did is I went into the underpinnings, and this is super deep design wonk for those of you who
Good.
are, all three of you who are excited about this. Is I figured out what the average damage output for each character is at each level. That's accounting for spells, weapons, and the like. And basically, spells progress much faster
Hmm.
than weapons do. But generally speaking, people who use weapons have a lot more opportunities to hit.
Right.
I cast one big spell versus I can attack 3 times.
Hmm.
So one of the big things I had to do for tricks was to add more attack multiple time tricks or refinements into the tricks to make sure that was actually happening. I also reduced the amount of damage that spells do to kind of get everything closer to a roughly predictable spread of damage.
Right.
So obviously, certain circumstances, certain character builds, you're going to get wildly different results. But on average, looking at all characters put together, you're generally going to output X amount of damage at each level.
Hmm.
Then I look at monsters and go, okay, if they get 3 solid hits, that monster goes down at that average amount.
Hmm.
So the idea is that you're not going to hit with every hit. So if there are 4 characters, if all of them take a turn and one of them misses, the 3 of them have a reasonable chance of taking that monster down before it gets a chance to respond.
Right.
But that's if everything goes well.
Right.
And I have found that Pugmire games, for whatever reason, tend to skew smaller scale,
Hmm.
tend to be 4 to 5 players. So the idea is if you really want to put all your cards in, all your chips in, and take out a monster real fast and spend your fortune hard, you can probably take it down before it acts if you
Hmm.
really want to. More likely it's going to be about 2 to 3 rounds.
Right.
How the math works is that they're going to get probably 1 or 2 good hits in before it goes down.
Hmm.
And again, that's just pure math. That's not accounting for tricks and whatnot. Because as a monster gets bigger, because again, that's assuming everyone's diving in at once, right? If everyone beats up on one monster at that same level, it's going to go down real fast. But if you have 4 of them, then I have 3 or 4 rounds to try to get those all kind of working out.
Hmm.
Um, uh, Also, there are what I'm calling tags, partially because I wanted to make enemies a little clearer. One thing that I thought was clear, but it turned out not to be clear, and a lot of people had some concerns about, was there are certain effects that affect, like, say, undead or unseen, but it's not entirely sure which are which. I thought it was clear. And so finally I said, well, then I'll just specifically, that monster is tagged unseen, that monster is tagged undead. So that way, if it has this tag, it has this effect on it. So that way, that part is super clear. But I also have what I'm calling a minion tag and a legendary tag.
Hmm.
So minion tag basically means it has 1 stamina point. So you hit it, it goes down. That is
Yeah.
the major change to it. It also fails all tests. So if something requires a test, what you used to call saving throw,
Hmm.
it just fails. So these are meant to be your Battle of Helm's Deep mowing through orcs moments, right? But that can apply to any character, any monster. So you can just put that tag on any of them and have that moment.
Obviously, have like a minion dragon. We're just like,
right. If you really wanted to, you could. On the vice versa, you could have a legendary giant worm. And legendary basically means that it has a much better chance to make those tests, and also has 3 times the stamina points.
I mean, in the Crossroads Continent game we played with Rich, we almost got taken out by a frog, a worm, and a fish. So
Yeah, I mean, that was hard, man. That was a hard game. Wow, that was
it
hard.
was fun, but it was definitely like
Matthew
harder
did
than I
not make
thought
it
it was going to be.
easier.
No,
Made it
Matthew
harder
did
than it
not
needed
make
to
it
be.
easier. Matthew was an antagonistic PC.
Right. But the idea is then that way, any character could be a boss monster. It doesn't always have to be, okay, well, I need a challenge. I need a hard fight, so I got to pick a certain challenge right now. And see, no, this character makes the most sense for the adventure, let's dump legendary tag on it and make it a bigger version of the other ones around it, and make sure that that is an interesting, compelling fight.
Yeah,
I've done some playtests. I think actually was in one of the playtests. And one of the, it was funny because like I did minions, and I did normal fight, and then I did legendary fight. And legendary fight, we ran out of time, but it was very clearly going to go badly.
yeah,
But I remember you specifically said, it's like minion fight. This is really easy. I'm like, that was the design. That was the point.
exactly. Yeah, like I had feedback for it that it seemed too easy, but I think the reason for that is that you wouldn't just throw like 4 minions at a party. You're
Right.
gonna throw like hundreds of them,
Yeah.
or they're gonna be six of them and a legendary, whatever. Like just extra things you have to take out.
Right.
Um, so
Yeah, I mean,
I like
because
it.
that was specifically a math kind of playtest.
Right.
And so it was the okay, I need to make sure these are as easy as I think they are. But yeah, you're right. In an actual game, it would have been like, okay, there's 4 characters. I probably throw like 20 of them in there.
Yeah, exactly. You're talking about multiple attacks earlier. My DM for our D&D game that we were playing for a while here, his least favorite thing was when I would say, and for my second attack,
Hmm.
because I was playing a ranger who had
Yep.
many attacks and was pretty devastating with them. So I would like take out something way faster than he anticipated,
Yes.
because of the multi-attack thing. And I thought it was fun. It was a good time.
And certainly there are going to be more options for that for martial characters
Mhm.
in Pugmire, because that was one period where initially I was like, I don't like multiple attacks. It
But
gets
it's
clunky, it gets weird.
fun.
But I mean, A, it's fun. B, I did not realize how much of the underlying math kind of requires it, because I hadn't been taking spells into account.
Hmm.
Spells are meant to be fireball. I have a bunch of stuff, but that's it. That's my load. I'm done. Whereas for like I said, with arch should be 3 or 4 arrows.
Yeah.
Um, and so I also kind of recalibrated the action economy a little bit to kind of undercut some other things. Like so, again, a chance to rename things.
Hmm.
I'm bouncing all over it. I'm sorry, but
That's okay.
these keep popping up. Um, so in 5e, there's an action, there's a bonus action, there's a reaction, and then there's free actions, which nobody
Hmm.
uses. Um, and it's a little clunky because like an action, if you want to use an action something else, you have to choose a different other sub thing to make it work.
Hmm.
And action can't really fit into any other category. Another category can't fit into it. But it's not everyone does its own thing. There's kind of weird overlaps. So since I had to rename everything, I just renamed everything into actions. So there's actions, there's supplemental actions, there's reflexive actions, again, kind of story path
Hmm.
connection, and there's free actions. But basically, an action can do any other kind of action, but no other kind of actions can't do an action. So if it has a adjective in front of it, that's the only thing it can do. But if
Hmm.
it's just an action can put any adjective in front of it. So if you want to do 2 bonus actions and skip your normal action, you can. If you want to do 2 move actions, just use your action as a move action, and you have 2 move actions. You have one of each of those, and then you have an additional action, which can be any of those.
Hmm.
And there's a chance to kind of actually clarify the language around it in a way that I couldn't do when I was beholden to the original terminology.
Yeah. No, it is. It is like I said. That's part of why we're not like freaking out about it. Is because it's nice to actually get to develop this a little bit. There may even be some changes post Kickstarter that happen because people will point things out or will notice
Oh,
something or
sure.
whatever. But
Yeah.
then like it gives us a chance to really develop this and develop the terminology that we want to use and stuff like that. So yeah,
Right.
I like it. Let's see, more questions. Will the unseen be changed or more detailed in 2E? Will species unite against unseen invasions?
So the second one is no. Species collectively understand the unseen is bad, but
Mm-hmm.
will continue to have very different ideas on how to go about dealing with it. Mainly because each species knows that the unseen can manipulate people,
Mm-hmm.
and it's hard to have a universally easy way to detect the unseen. So you don't know if, say, you're a dog and you see a cat acting weird, you don't know if that cat's just weird, if that cat is possessed by the unseen, or if that cat has other things going on.
Yeah.
Because the unseen want that division. That's part of their goal, is to actually make sure there are wedges between the different species. That's intentional and something for the players to potentially overcome. That's what I want. I want to have some implicit conflicts for people to overcome.
Right.
Um, as for explaining things more, not quite. From a mechanical perspective, things are clearer. The unseen are actually packaged together.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have more explicit named unseen demons.
Cool.
So it's not going to be it's a major demon or minor demon. Now it's going to be like this specific demon.
Hmm.
And we have 3 or 4 examples in the core book, and allows us to make a lot more that way. And you get a better sense of what their various intents are through those write-ups.
Hmm.
But they're never meant to be a homogenous, unified force. They're just a thing that's out there, and they all have different agendas, but they have certain common tactics that are common enough that other species have learned to recognize them. So, in terms of making it easier to run the unseen as a guide, yes, there'll be more
Hmm.
advice and guides and structure on that. Future books, I think maybe Dogs of Pugmire may go a little more into it. I'm not sure yet. There's another book that I'm still sorting out that may go into instead. So I
Hmm.
think there'll be other advice for the unseen coming out in future products. But they'll always be kind of a mysterious collecting force because, I mean, the word demon is intentional, right?
Hmm.
Demons are never meant to, if you look at even like biblical tradition demons, Satan is not in charge of all demons. Satan's just the guy on the throne right now, and they all have ways to kind of overthrow and manipulate and
Hmm.
potentially get control of hell. There's lots of fiction around different factions of demons. I wanted to kind of tie into that. Plus, also it ties into some of the deeper setting secrets, which I won't talk about here. But if you go to the Onyx Path cast, listen to our setting secret thing where I just dumped all of that, you'll find out why some of this is working out the way it is.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so it's clearer. It's a little more understandable and easier parts for guides to give them more advice.
Hmm.
But as a result of that, it will actually realize that there's a lot more going on. Like for example, there are demon cults in both Pugmire and the Monarchies of Mao that were kind of implicit in the original edition. That are maybe a little more explicit now that yes, these people know they're worshiping demons and or are obsessed by demons.
Right. I mean that makes sense though too. You know, like there's gonna be bad cats and dogs sometimes.
Yeah, yeah,
Bad rats.
right. And they think they're doing good, but that
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean they are.
I'm assuming that the cult of Laborator is coming back. It's just me asking you a
Yes,
question now.
yes. I don't. I think if I got rid of the cult, I would probably have a riot. It has weirdly become like the one of the most popular antagonistic factions in the game.
I think partially because I just love how much they've like misread and misinterpreted things and have become like a weird evil cult around that. It makes me happy to think about just how like odd their terminology and phrasing is and their understanding of science.
Yeah, and it's actually been really cool. Is because as Squeaks in the Deep has gone out, I have seen a few people say, "Now I get what the cult was referencing," right? Because the cult was always kind of this weird, twisted version of what rodents were actually looking into, and seeing people kind of get that, oh, this is all kind of how it connects
Hmm.
was really exciting. And I know you and I talked about that when you worked on the book too, a certain
Yeah.
amount of trying to make sure that those pieces were connected and but not so connected that people go, oh, they're identical, because that's not. It should be close enough that people who are not in rodent society can make that you're all one group,
Right.
but people inside of it were very clear. Player characters are very clear which side is which. Um, and so the cult of Laborator is originally I debated removing it from the Pugmire core rulebook, honestly, because it really is more of a both a rodents and cats antagonist group.
Hmm.
Uh, but on reflection, I decided instead that I would have anything that was in the first edition of Pugmire for as an enemy. I would have new stats for it in second edition, so people wouldn't have to do any conversion work. So if you saw it in first edition, you'll have it in second edition, and there'll be more on top of that.
Nice.
So the cult is in there, but I'm probably not going to explore more of them until one of the other books because I really feel like they need to be featured in either Monarchies or Squeak's second edition because that's really where that cult makes more sense from
Yeah.
a larger perspective.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Like they're primary Squeaks antagonists because you know the mice and rats of Squeaks are trying to be like we're not those guys. Those
Right.
guys are weird. Like.
Right. And I still feel very strongly that and some people have caught this is that it's expression of fanatical radicalism, right? They're the radicalists.
Rat radicalism.
Radicalists. um,
Sorry, I couldn't help
this is
myself.
my brand. This is my brand. No. The idea that good people can be painted as in a bad light because of a few people who are really far divorced from their core faith. And I think that's the problem that we deal with in the real world.
Yeah, a
So I
lot.
wanted to make sure that it was reflected in a way that people could engage with it without being too overwhelmed with the real world context of it.
Yeah,
And that
or too preachy in general. You just don't want to do that.
right. And if you don't want to engage with that, honestly, they make good mad scientists. Um, uh, Frankly, have the cult is a good reason to justify just about anything in the game. It's like, oh, they did the experiment and this horrible thing happened. Okay, well, what is the horrible thing? Doesn't matter. The point is, it's the cult is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, one of the things that I was getting concerned about in first edition is that the cult became everything. Everyone loved to write the cults. Everyone loved to do the cult. I actually had to tell people it needed to ease up on the cult laboratory because everyone wanted to contribute to because they were so excited by it. Uh,
It was also the ant problem that we kept having, or the like giant
yeah,
bug problem that we kept having in Pugmire for a while, where that was in all the art and also like all the adventures. We're like, you're gonna fight a giant
right.
bug, and it's like there's other things to fight.
Right, exactly. There was one point where I realized that we had three different kind of giant spiders across three different early Pugmire products. And so that's one thing actually I pull that stuff and kind of actually put it into the core rule book. So here's all the spiders in one spot, do spiders ever again. Um, but the other thing I also did before going to the next question is I've also reorganized the enemy chapter a bit more because initially it was just alphabetical,
Mm-hmm.
but now there are groups. There are animals. There's a whole bunch of templates for just people.
Mm-hmm.
So as opposed to we're doing a lot of like take the cat bandit and use it as your townsperson, but change like half the stats. So now I actually have instead like here's a craft person, here's an assassin, here's a mage, and then you tweak it according to species how you want to.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a whole of just people, and then the unseen are in a section, and the undead are in a section, and there's a section just monsters, specifically spelled out as monsters. These are just things you can't negotiate with, you can't hang out with, you can't make friends with. They're just horrible critters you have to deal with.
Right.
So uh, uh, that will hopefully also make it clear this is what we expect you to use characters in this category for.
Mm-hmm. I kind of like that, like spelling out the differences between like things that can be negotiated with and things that just can't.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can't negotiate with the dune sandworms. You
Right,
you just
right.
can't.
Although one thing I did add to Monsters I forgot to mention is that I brought back again, evoking older game systems, is that the now has morale.
Mm-hmm.
So enemies can retreat after a certain point in
Oh
time.
yeah, we had that happen in the playtest, didn't we?
Yeah. The default is basically down to roughly 25 hit points, but you can change that by monster.
Mm-hmm.
And also there are certain powers and spells that now react to morale tests to encourage you scare monsters away. Again, like minions always fail those, so they just
Mm-hmm.
run. And legendary characters don't take morale tests because they're the big boss monster. You don't want them to run away.
Right.
But all the monsters or all the enemies in between, it's possible you could scare them away or negotiate with them. And so having a mechanic there specifically allows you to kind of tap into that was important to me.
Yeah, no, I am a big fan of the, let's negotiate with this monster things because I've
Yeah.
done that in quite a few games and it's always really fun.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're smarter than they are on some level because you could just
Yeah.
use like big words and roll some good tests and then, next thing you know, they're like, "Oh no, you're right. I should let you go past me. You're
Yeah.
correct." And it's fun to do that sometimes. Like not everything has to be round by round combat, you know?
And I have found even people who play a lot of D&D are still more inclined to talk in playing Pugmire, and that's something I've consistently seen is that something about the game encourages people to talk to characters rather than necessarily fight them. And so I wanted to make sure that that was a little more buried into the rules.
I don't know why that actually is, but in my brain it's because I don't want to see their animal get hurt.
I think that's
Like
part of it.
the only one that I threw headlong into danger constantly was Laszlo, and that's because that was his personality. Was
Right.
whatever. But most of my Pugmire characters that I've played over the years have definitely been a little bit more cautious or a little bit more like, okay, let's talk, let's negotiate, let's please don't hit my cat, you know.
But that's actually interesting to point out is because Laszlo, when you played
Him.
when you played him, uh, a lot of the characters kind of organically went, "Oh, Laszlo's being a bit strange, and we should kind of work around that and make sure that we don't let him get in fights." But Laszlo acts like every D&D character ever,
Yeah, pretty much.
so it's interesting to see that without me spelling that out necessarily, Although I do actually spell out in the guide rules in this new edition, you have to kind of hear the beats
Hmm.
of the game modes overall. One of them is you can make friends with anybody. Um, but even with first edition, when that wasn't spelled out, people still kind of naturally, you're right, went to, oh, there's animals and they're cute. We want to kind of just be friends and be cozy.
Yeah, I mean that's what most depictions of a lot of these animals in media have been. Like, yes, there are exceptions. There's your Watership Down or your Animal Farm or whatever, where the animals are a little bit more brutal for whatever
Yeah.
reason. But for the most part, like when I think of Pugmire, my brain goes to like Beatrix Potter from when I was a kid because like
Mm-hmm.
I had all the Beatrix Potter books or like Winnie the Pooh. Like it's not that cutesy obviously or that childlike, but those were some of the early exposures I had to like these are talking animals that dress like people.
Right.
And so that's like so deep in my brain that whenever I, see a little cat, even if it's wearing armor and threatening me, I'm still like, kitty. Like,
Yes.
it's cute. And so, yeah, I am all about solving problems with words or just making friends. Like, just friend
Yeah.
shaped.
One of the additions to New Edition is that we actually have a way of when you first encounter a character, you can determine kind of on a 5 point scale
Hmm.
whether they're your best friend or your worst enemy, and then you can make rolls to adjust that level of relationship. So again, it's light. It's not really complicated, but it's more than we had before to be able to say, okay, you run into this person, roll a random roll. They're neutral to you. They don't really know much about you. I want to make a charisma roll to make them like me. Okay, now I have to do that kind of twice to make them a really good friend, but at least once we get me to friendly. Again, allows you to kind of play in that space a lot more and gives you a little more rigor to it.
Yeah, I think we should make friends with this terrifying two-headed giant behind us in the artwork, like this cat dog troll thing. Because I bet he's got some problems he could talk about with us.
Well, probably twice as many problems as
Yeah,
normal.
yeah. So instead of shooting that arrow at him, cat below me, you should say hi.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I think that another fun concept is like one of those characters, which I mean, there are dogs like this and cats like this, and children and people to whom everything is friend shaped,
Yes.
and they don't really see danger where they should. I
Right.
think I think honestly, Yosha has a bit of that going on
Yes.
in as for the Pugmire canon characters.
Yep.
Because she's just so curious about things, and she's very like everything's having good faith, and then Jack or whoever is like no 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 come back.
Right. And I mean, to be fair, I have a dog right now, Darby. She is everyone's friend. She looks like a big scary monster, but she just loves absolutely everyone.
Hmm.
And there's been plenty of times where it's like, Darby, you can't go in the street and make a friend with the car because it's coming at you right now, baby.
Right. Yeah. No. I have there's a dog that lives upstairs from me named Jasper. Also, the sun just came out, so I'm blown out right now.
Okay.
Um, it's been raining all day, so my stuff is adjusted for that. So sorry that I'm bright white. I'm fixing it right now. Yeah, I didn't ask for this. It's okay. I'm gonna fix it. There. Haha. But yeah, so like Jasper, everything is friend shaped. People, animals, squirrels, whatever. It's all friend shaped.
Right.
I'll save my videos just all kinds of weird stuff, whatever. But yeah, so like that's great in a friendly dog on a leash, but maybe not when you're on an adventure dealing with giant spiders.
Exactly.
Because
Yep.
some giant spiders aren't friend shaped.
Turns out not all spiders are friends.
Yeah. Just a few more questions going on here. So, will the underneath be explored at all in the Realms core, at least mechanically, if not like the lore, or will the system and squeaks convert reasonably well for the time being?
The latter.
Okay.
Uh, uh, the way that we wrote the underneath in Squeaks and Deep was meant to be more kind of here's how you build kind of an organic dungeon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that should all work more or less fine. Like I said, we'll have a conversion guide to kind of help you with some of the stickier bits. Um, but no, it's because the underneath really is more about the rodents, and I want to make sure to keep it to that. So whenever we get around to Squeaks and Deep Second Edition, we'll probably have a lot more underneath stuff. Obviously recap the stuff we did before, but then
Mm-hmm.
allow for even more options because I really feel like that kind of level of weird, it's not horror, but it's horror adjacent.
I
Um,
think we use words like creepy and spooky a lot. We're talking about
yes,
it.
yeah,
Like
creepy.
it's creepy. It's not horrific.
Right. And certainly dogs, cats, whatever can go into there. and that's fine. But I feel like it makes more sense to give it that space. The core, I mean, it's got a lot to do. I mean, the original core book had a lot to do.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of really keeping it not much not much bigger than the original. I mean, it's gonna be bigger physically, even it's gonna be about 8.5 by 11 book this time.
Yeah.
But word count wise, it's gonna be a little bit because I've got a lot more stuff I have to cover to make this all kind of progress and add new stuff in.
Hmm.
Um, so I mean, I would love to have a 800-page book with absolutely everything in it, but that's just not the
No,
market right now.
we
So
already did page 20 in Exalted 3. I
yes,
don't.
right, exactly. Maybe at some point in time, when after 20 years, we'll do Pugmire 20th anniversary edition, and then we'll have a
Pug
big leather
20.
book, Pug 20.
I love it. I love Pug 20.
I mean, to be fair, we're already 8 years into it, so it's not that far away.
Oh God, we are, aren't we?
Yeah, 2015 is when we
Jeez.
announced it.
Jeez. No, I remember, I will never forget while like that Kickstarter was happening because I was at a party with some friends, like a big brunch.
Hmm.
Well, one of those kind of parties where people just go in and out and there's music and you just kind of hang out all day and like drink mimosas and eat food. It was just like
Hmm.
a really chill party, but like I kept checking my phone because Kickstarter was just doing gangbusters, and I was
Yeah,
like looking at my friends like, holy crap, this thing I worked on has gone up to 100K or whatever, and it was just ridiculous. There's so many.
right, right.
Um, so yeah, I it's hard to imagine that it's been that long. That's so weird to think about.
I recognize that, especially after the past 2 years, time is really weird.
Oh yeah,
But I've had a lot of people who are like, it's too soon for a new edition. It's like it's not. It really isn't. It's been almost a decade. I mean, we've had a good run, but it's time to kind of do some fresh ideas.
yeah,
And it's something I've been really trying hard to reiterate to make people kind of understand. But I get it. It's like, especially if you just bought the book a year ago, if this is the first time you're seeing it, it seems real fast to you. But then
right.
recognizing like we announced it 2015, Kickstarter 2016, the book came out very early 2017.
So
So
even then,
even
it's
if you
been
count
six
just from the
years. Yeah,
right, even count just from the book, right, it's 6 years. I mean, we're going to be close to 6 years on the dot of the original Pugmire Kickstarter.
yeah. And I personally think that the underneath really needs like a lot of room to talk about it because there's
Right,
so much that could be down there, like so much. Because once again, don't know what happened to humanity.
right.
Although it would be funny if you just opened it up to the page on the underneath and it said, "Please see the world below," and linked to your Onyx Path book.
So yeah, there you go. See, Pugmire is actually what's above the world below. There you
Yeah,
go.
I mean that's where I always put humans when you and I have talked about my headcanon. I have like Fallout or Wool style vaults of people
Yep.
that just haven't come out because they still think it's dangerous for whatever reason,
Hmm.
and so they've just been down there for however long, living underground. Which okay,
I mean, you could run an entire game of something like that with underground, politics, whatnot, and then have a different group running a Pugmire game, and then finally have them meet in the middle.
I have made that joke before that I would like run some kind of like Fallout style game because there is a Fallout RPG, but
Yeah,
like keep it in the vault
right.
until the dogs show up and be like, interact, have fun. Uh, yes, what's it? Eddie mentioned Mao and Squeaks 2E. Do we have plans for more books? Do we have plans for books more in line with pirates, showcasing other parts of the world, like in north of the mountains or anything?
Not at the moment. So to kind of talk about the structure a little bit. Like I said before a couple times. The first issue was book by book. It was just kind of whether book we thought made sense. So we did pirates initially because it was like we weren't sure about how well the rodent book would go over at the moment. So I was
Hmm.
like, everyone knows pirates. So that's not the entirety of it. I'm kind of collapsing a lot of business decisions down to a kind of short, pithy note to kind of give a sense of how they'll structure. We're now doing this in waves. So wave one is core rule book and all of the stretch goals.
Right.
Wave two is right now 7 whole books. That's the 3 players guides. There's just going to be monarchies and Squeaks 2E. Obviously, there's also going to be a Realms of Pugmire book in the same vein. So it's going to cover things like Houndton and
Hmm.
Mutt Town, as well as adventures and whatnot. And then there's going to be a 7th book, which we haven't announced yet. Uh, and then we're going to see how those do.
Right.
And then after that, we could do a 3rd wave of books.
Hmm.
And that's usually how we do most of our game lines. Like, for example, let's say Trivity. We do Aberrants, and
Hmm.
then we do Trinity Core. That's the first kind of wave. And then we do Aberrants, and then all the attendant stretch goals around that second wave. And now we're in the process of doing 6 books for Aberrant, or 5 or 6, somewhere around there. X number of books for Aberrant. We get those kind of going and rolling, and then we'll see how those do. And then, so that way we can, each time we do that, we assume, okay, if this is the end of the line, what do we need to absolutely cover?
Right.
So
Exactly.
right now, I absolutely need to cover more or less the ground I covered in first edition, but more. Each of those books are going to be expanded and bigger than they were before. But I still need to kind of cover that ground and make sure by the end of this wave, everything is found in first edition will have a second edition equivalent and more besides. Then from there, I can go even further beyond those boundaries if I want to, if it makes sense, if the audience is still there. Obviously, that's great. But my goal is I got to get those pieces in place first. So I have some vague ideas for those. I have mentioned previously a secret project in mind that kind of vaguely sort of ties into that idea, but I'm not going to say any more than that. So I mean, I've got lots of ideas. I mean, the fact is, I've been doing this for so many years, and I'm still making new games. Is shows that I think there's a lot of potential here. But I've got to stay focused on. Well, right now I have to focus on the core rulebook, but then, unlike last time, I do have a longer term plan.
Right.
And I've already got one of those projects underway. The second one's waiting for me to revise this manuscript before I get that started. And then from there, I'm probably just going to hire some developers and have them take over some of these books because I can't do them all myself. So.
It's true. We learned that lesson on other game lines.
Yes, we
Having
did.
one person try to develop all of the books in a game line is a bad idea.
Yeah.
That's why we have lots of Exalted developers and Sign developers, Trinity developers, and things. Is because like that's just too much.
Yep.
Eddie will, of course, will have final say on things,
Oh,
and
sure.
you know, because that's how it works when you're the owner of an IP.
Yep.
But but past that, yeah, we're probably gonna have some other folks doing stuff. Heck, maybe me.
Who knows?
I
But I
don't
mean, yeah,
know.
I mean, it'll probably be along the lines of like either I'll have a partial or full outline, say here's all
Yeah.
stuff I need to cover. Feel free to adjust it, make it your own,
Mm-hmm.
and then we'll have future books up there. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of potential. I for a long time I was reluctant to do lots of big location books because I don't think they do very well financially, and also I feel like it limits creativity. But I have seen a lot of books in the past few years that find different ways to approach that problem. I mean, and honestly, truth be told, Chicago by Night was one of them. The V5 Chicago by Night Magic did a great job of saying Ticking was basically a city book and turning it into something that was a much, much better resource
Yeah.
than just being a city book.
No, it's fantastic. I mean, I still use it when I play with my Sombra, obviously. But also,
Right.
we played a Chronicle set in Chicago because of that book. Like, it was something
Yeah.
that my GM definitely like used as a resource for
Mm-hmm.
my storyteller.
Right. But I mean, it's that perfect balance. It's like you have a playable option, you have some information about how that playable option ties into the larger setting. You have a lot of setting information, then a strong chronicle in the back of the book and lots of NPCs. That's a good combination of things that makes it much more useful than just here's some information about a city, right?
Right.
So I think I want to see how that model plays out because in my head I think it works well. I think Pirates was a good prototype of that, but we have to do a bigger version of that. Like for example, one of the things I want to do is both Squeaks and, well, less Squeaks, more Pirates. I wasn't really happy with how character creation turned out. I thought we emulated too much rather than actually presenting genuine options. Squeaks is a better job, I think. But I felt like
Like
Lizards
getting red
and
lines on my work in real time, live.
well, I mean, no, it
Because I
was
wrote both of those.
I made decisions
Right.
to cram those into a small space that ended up causing them to not get the attention they deserved.
Yes.
And in fact, if anything, I cut down your work because I was trying to hit to a certain aesthetic that turns out was probably the wrong decision.
Okay. I thought it was
So
funny
no,
because you were like,
yeah.
this was bad. I'm like, I wrote
Right.
both of them, so all right.
Right. So past Dixie was terrible and current Dixie is great, is what I'm saying.
Yes! I've gotten better with age.
But
Like
yeah, so I
cheese.
mean, I think with this first wave, I'll see if some of my ideas bear up. But this goes back to why I'm doing a second edition at all, because I've learned a lot, right? I've learned about Pugmire, I've learned about game design. I've learned a lot about, I'm always trying to learn about how to better my craft. And I think being a chance to kind of do a better job this time around, not, I won't say do it right, but do it better, will really help. And I think that will make for a stronger game overall.
That's awesome. The last question we have in the chat as of right now, feel free to put any more questions in if you have one. Do you have any 10th anniversary plans for
Probably get
Pugmire?
drunk. Maybe post
which
about it.
which is really rare for Eddy actually. So that's a
To be
big
fair, yeah,
celebration.
I'm not as much of a drinker as I used to be. I mean, nothing right now because frankly, I'm so outside of just doing this Kickstarter and doing a new edition,
You can talk about your life.
I am also moving from Atlanta, Georgia to the United Kingdom. And I was that involved getting British citizenship and involved shipping my dog, where today I've gotten a whole bunch of changes I have to do at the last minute to make that happen. In fact, I got a few more I have to do after this switch because the service screwed up. Um,
Timing is
so,
everything.
right. So doing a Kickstarter as I'm getting on a plane was a great idea. So there's a lot I'm going through right now, and then of course it's going to be the getting a new place to live and culture shock. So like a lot of this year is going to be just adapting, frankly,
Yeah.
both to my new status quo and also to what happens because it is. I'm trying not to be hyperbolic, but what happens with this Kickstarter will shape a lot of second edition plans. It's not like they'll like ruin them.
Mm-hmm.
Rich is actually pretty committed to some strong Realms of Pugmire support with this new version. One of the reasons why we're doing this is because we can actually roll that out pretty consistently. But to then tack on any kind of anniversary stuff on top of that is a bit much for me to even think about right now.
Also, keep in mind that the 10th anniversary of Pugmire, depending on when you count it, will either be 2025 or 2027 if we're talking
Right,
about release date.
right.
So if that is the case, then I think Eddie has plenty of time to think of something fun
That's
to
also
do
true.
for the 10th anniversary. Like, we could definitely do something. Have a big Twitch stream, have a big party. We could play a game together and talk about Pugmire. We could do all kinds of stuff.
Right.
But we have 2 to 4 years to plan that out, depending on when we want to set the anniversary.
And also, if you talk about 2025, I mean, odds are pretty good. Our timetable has generally been about 2 years from Kickstarter to release. So the second issue will be coming out in 2025. So I mean that degree that's the 10th anniversary is the second edition. So you can
Yeah.
think of it that way, possibly.
And maybe we will have a party. Who knows?
Yeah,
Anything can happen in the next 2 years. Lots of things. Um,
indeed.
let's see. Can you talk a little bit about the spell changes?
Yeah. So there's kind of three rough categories of things we do with spells. The first is pretty minor, but it was important to me, is that people who are not familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, we're bouncing a lot off of the concept of spell level.
Mm-hmm.
Because to their logic was, I'm level 3, why can't I cast level 3 spells?
Yes, I have that problem sometimes, and I've been playing D&D since I was 7 years old, and I still like look at Pugmire, look at D&D, and I'm like, what? Spell
Right,
level should just be your level.
right. So that's been renamed to magnitude, which we actually used quite well in Squeaks and Deep. So we're just going to kind of carry that language through
Mm-hmm.
entirely. So now it's just it's a arbitrary number, well not arbitrary, but it's a number that tells you how powerful your spell is.
It's completely arbitrary. We just threw numbers at it.
It's 27, sure, whatever, magnitude
8.
27. It's
403.
square root of infinity. That's your magnitude. um, the second was that when I first, as I mentioned before, I was converting 3.5, and then at the last minute kind of switched to 5th edition because of a variety of legal reasons. And I didn't get a chance to really add in the idea of overcasting, of making a spell more powerful by putting more
Upcasting.
upcasting, yeah. And especially because I've converted to spell slots, it should be even easier, and it was easier to kind of just say, okay, well, if you spend this many spell slots versus that many spell slots, you get a bigger effect. So we now have a lot more options to kind of do that. You can now make that spell even bigger, and that ties into the third change, which is that because we're moving further away from core Dungeons and Dragons assumptions, we had a chance to combine spells that didn't really make sense as separate spells.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because now you can say, well, okay, you cast a spell, but if you cast at its higher level, like a different spell. So as an example, we have a cloud spell. and it has Stinking Cloud and Cloud Kill and
Hmm.
Gas Cloud and a couple other spells in it. It's just one spell. You can cast it at higher levels as you want to. So if you really want to cast Cloud Kill level 1, you can. You'll be getting rid of all of your spell points and or spell slots, and you have to kind of maximize your character at level 1 to even get that many spell slots to do it. But you could do it
Hmm.
if you really wanted to. So it has more flexibility than the usual spell system allows for. Uh, and then kind of outside of those three things, there's a bit of tweaking the language, tweaking the flavor and color a little bit. There are a lot of elemental spells that only are tied to one element. There wasn't really any need to, so you can now do things like you can decide if this is a fire spell or an ice spell or a sonic spell or whatever.
Hmm. Which is cool, and that makes the
Yeah.
most sense. I mean, we did a lot of that when we were trimming down Exalted for Essence. Is being
Hmm.
like, almost every kind of Exalt has fling a bolt of power at somebody. It's just a
Right.
different kind of power.
Yep.
So that's where we got. I think it's the Glorious Exalted Bolt or something. I forget what it's called, but that's your fireball spell,
Right.
or your sunbeam spell, whatever. Because it's the same motion, it's the same idea, it's just different
Yeah,
pieces.
and especially with the Onyx 20 system, I mean, all you're really swapping in is the adjectival damage.
Hmm.
Fire damage, ice damage, sonic damage, whatever.
Yeah.
So there's no reason not to just say you could change this word.
Hmm. Exactly. If we haven't already discussed it, do you plan to go into more depth on the Badger tribe? You talked a little bit about it.
So I will say the core rule book will talk a bit more about them than they did before, mainly because I presented them a certain way.
Mhm.
A lot of the writers in the first round of books took them the way I didn't intend to, and it ended up getting so bad to the point where I remember Dixie and her project she developed had to actually put in a sidebar saying, no, seriously, this is how badgers work. And then I had to point a lot of people to that sidebar saying, no, seriously, this is how badgers work. So we're refining that a bit more. One of those is that this book is going to be a nebulous number of years in the future, only a few, not many, but it is some number of years.
Mhm.
And one of those is that Kibu the Red, which is kind of alluded to in the first edition book as gathering the tribes together, has now done that. They're now
Okay.
actually under Kibu the Red as king. And so that kind of allows us to smooth that out. We give a little more options for the Badgers as antagonists.
Mhm.
And then down the road, currently I'm aiming for the Realms of Pugmire actual source book to probably have the Badger playable rules in that because it makes sense for dogs and those groups to kind of they connect together, and some of the story ideas I have for that book will tie to this rise of Keep of the Red and what that means for the other Pugmire cities.
Mhm.
So at some point I do have idea um, towards getting that kind of all resolved.
Mhm. And I mean, you could make friends with badgers too. I'm assuming in this version more because
Yeah,
like they were. It was never intended to be that, but I know that in the first edition they almost always were cast as like villains.
yeah,
Every single time they're like
right,
evil badger tribes, and like we never want to say that like all of one species is evil. We never want to say that like a tribal people are less than a city dwelling people. Like
yeah,
that's a weird thing to think.
right.
And
They
it just
they're
kind of
they're
happened.
always yeah they're kind of becoming the orcs, which I didn't like.
Right.
Um, and I always wanted to portray them as desperate.
Mm-hmm.
They will take advantage of abandoned civilization, and they will occasionally, particularly aggressive or desperate tribes, will actually kind of just overthrow villages.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I always intended that to be kind of case by case and also kind of a weird exception. But it's the weird exception that gets everyone's attention.
Right.
Uh, so it's like hashtag all badgers, or do this. Um, and that, but I think everyone kind of saw the extreme exception and said, nope, that is exactly how they all are. So I made that a little more kind of nuanced and clear, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
But they still have value as antagonists because they do shun civilization. Civilization's done nothing to benefit them. In fact, civilization's done lots to hurt them. So they have zero interest in treating civilization in good faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping that nuance is now clearer, so it's not just, oh, these are the guys that we have to kill to get treasure from.
Yeah, and if you want to know why badgers are the weird exception, go listen to our Setting Secrets podcast that we did because we talked
Yes,
about that.
yes,
Because yeah, I loved mythology behind all the different uplifted species, and I think the badgers are super interesting. Um, I'm a huge fan of being able to play like a ferret or a weasel or something. I'm very much
Hmm.
looking forward to one of those. I even posted some art in the Discord the other day of like it's like a ferret standing up with little boots on, a little cavalier hat.
Oh yeah,
Just
that was great.
I'm like me whenever these rules come out. Because it'll be fun, but also it'll be a very different tone of game from probably most Pugmire games, unless you're
Right.
playing like a bunch of mutts that live out in the wilderness. Then it might be similar.
Right, and that's why moving those into a source book that
Hmm.
basically says here's some setting information and a way to kind of play that tone a little better makes more sense and kind of puts it all into one space. Because I mean, again, Realms of Pugmire has a default play style, and I need to make sure that the core rulebook is more focused on that, which means that other people are naturally going to be framed as at least mildly antagonistic to that default play style.
Exactly. And yes, whenever we say badgers, we are referring to most of the mustelids or mustelids, however you say that.
Mm-hmm.
I know that it's I know you changed lizards to reptiles for this, which does
Yeah.
make sense because we
Yes.
had snakes, turtles, and lizards essentially within the reptiles. I
Right.
don't know why we didn't think about that for the pirates book, but we didn't.
I don't know.
I never once thought of that, and I wrote
Yeah.
them. Uh,
I didn't realize it until like a year after the book was published, and I was like, we really should call them reptiles. So
yeah, yeah, really should have. One of us should have thought of that, but we didn't. That said, are you thinking? Have you thought at all about renaming the badger tribe since they include like ferrets and
maybe
whatever?
they're still called badger tribes in the core rulebook right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, they may call that very likely they'll call themselves something different.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there is value in like let me step back. For example, I do have slightly refined versions of how the rodents work
Okay.
in second edition, based on what we wrote in Squeaks and Deep. But dogs still see them in roughly the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to find out, oh, actually, no, the reason why rodents collect all this weird stuff is because they're trying to do science experiments. No, it's they collect this weird stuff. Maybe they're greedy. We don't know. Um, I hedge that a little more so people realize there's more going on beneath the surface, but the dogs don't recognize that deep surface. So and the dogs still call reptiles lizards
Mm.
because they only really engage with the lizards, so they kind of just lump them all together. So there's going to be stuff like that going on. Again, I'm sure that the once they're under Cube of the Red, they may have a different term now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and because of the language barrier, they don't necessarily understands the nuances of what dogs call them.
Mm-hmm.
So for the moment, it is the same. But yeah, it may change when we get to the final book, or sorry, when we get to the book that covers those. They probably have a different name.
Cool. That was a Dixie question because I just
Yeah,
thought of that.
I don't know yet. Yeah, honestly.
If we're going away from D&D, will spell slots become spell points or something else, or is spell
Uh,
slot not a term we care about?
honestly, I'm gonna keep them probably spell slots. I mean, I may change the points. I don't know yet. I'm still up in the air on that. We'll see kind of what happens. At the moment, they're still slots. Uh, yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought that through yet.
I me personally as Dixie, not like answering a question. Like I like the idea of like spell points into the slots because slots when I was younger especially always confused me. I was like, am I
Mm.
putting them somewhere? Like, is there a shelf in my head that I have to like put spells into? And it didn't make nearly as much sense to me as just like spend 2 points, you have 15 spell power. You know.
Fair enough. You've convinced me. I'll make a note.
I love that you're just making notes during this.
Wonderful.
That's these are for. Um,
Yes, I mean, I will never be like, oh no, I'm more smart than you. I'm the right decision. Um, but sometimes I do need to be convinced. But you know, this is convincing me, so I'll do that probably tomorrow at this point. But
you've learned something in real time, people. We have changed it right now.
yep,
Uh, we have another question. We have a couple more questions. We are getting 20 minutes to the end.
yep,
So I'm just going to answer as many as we can. So if anybody has any last minute ones, please start putting them in. Because Eddie will obviously talk at length about anything you ask him.
yes, sure.
It's almost like you like Pugmire.
What?
So uplifted are based on common pets, but the sea is acid. Was that a no fish decision?
Not initially, but it became one. So I did make a passing reference to fish in first edition,
Mm-hmm.
which I've never followed up on. And at one point in time, I did think, okay, what would that look like? And it is what I in my head call the Aquaman problem, which is if
Yeah.
you read Aquaman comics or watch Aquaman media, Aquaman's super cool in Atlantis, And Aquaman is super cool when you put him in the Justice League outside of Atlantis, but you rarely get people dragged into Atlantis besides Aquaman or his immediate group into his adventures.
Hmm.
Um,
Because they can't breathe underwater.
right. There's a logistical hurdle on that front. So even though I had already established the asset before I ran into this problem, and it's like that's a surmountable issue if I really
Hmm.
wanted to, but it just came down to it's such a specialized setting that I don't think a lot of people would be super enthusiastic about it. And if you take fish outside of that aquatic setting, it becomes they stop being really fish, right?
Yeah.
So it's one of the few common pets that I've just kind of skated over. I expect someone will probably want to do something for Canis Minor, and I encourage them to do so. Because I personally am not seeing a strong, compelling approach to that. I'm not saying there isn't one, but all the options I've thought of either dilute, pardon the pun, the aquatic setting and therefore make it stop being a meaningfully aquatic setting and aquatic people, or change and deform the core game so much that I might as well make a new game.
Yeah. I definitely think there's room in the setting for like an NPC that's an uplifted aquatic creature.
Absolutely.
Like,
Absolutely.
you're a pirate, you're on that sea, you run into a talking shark and whatever, and he
Right.
tells you what's on that island over there. Because one thing that a lot of folks don't always think about when they think about what animals should be in Pugmire is what species would humans uplift.
Right.
Because we know we would uplift dogs and cats, right?
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
Mice and rats would probably be uplifted first because of testing,
Hmm.
because that's how we test things
Yep.
for a lot of science. It's on animals. It's not great, but it's what happens. So they're testing the uplifting stuff on mice and rats. Cool. So now we have them, and they go, okay, it works. So let's do dogs and cats.
Right.
Um, and then there's a secret about the badgers that you can listen to that podcast episode for. But
Right.
like, I don't know how many fish humans would uplift aside from maybe to like study underwater. Like that is the
Yeah.
one reason I can see uplifting certain fish. And
Hmm.
even then, knowing humans, they'd probably just do like dolphins and whales.
Right. Which are
And
mammals and get back to yeah.
right, and then they would say like, "Hey, go down to the bottom of the ocean and tell me what's there, because we don't know because the ocean is scary."
Right.
Uh, but that's really the only reason. Like, I feel like if I had a pet fish, I don't know what I would do with an uplifted fish. Like, we can't really communicate all that well. It's in a tank. I feel bad now because I get it in a tank. You
Right.
know?
Yeah, exactly. If you uplift it, it's going to be well, I need to engage with it in a way that no longer requires water, which defeats the purpose, frankly.
Right. Exactly.
So yeah, I mean, I could see why people would have fun with that, and certainly we touched on some aquatic stuff in Pirates of Pugmire.
Mhm.
But as a setting book, it's right now just too thin for me, so I probably won't be getting to it anytime soon.
Yeah. But as always, if you want to play it,
Yeah, absolutely.
Canis Minor exists or make it. It could be
Hmm.
very fun. It could be fun to have a fish adventure. I don't know. I've played I Am Fish. It was fun.
Yeah.
um, yeah, with a question, is Genghis Khan or the Mongolian Empire a reasonable real world reference for the Badger tribes? They're not sure how accurate this is.
Um, if it helps you to connect with them, I'm not going to say you shouldn't. But I've tried very hard to not make any of the species a one-to-one correlation with a real world setting.
Hmm.
I try to, whenever possible, blur the lines. So, for example, rodents are part of a wide diaspora, a wide group of diasporic peoples.
Hmm.
There's a little bit of the Irish diaspora, a little bit of Jewish diaspora, a little bit of the Russian diaspora in there. Um, uh, the monarchies are a little bit of Japanese samurai time period, but also it's a lot of Chinese, War of the Three Kingdoms,
A lot of Renaissance too.
Renaissance
Like,
Italy,
yeah.
yeah, a lot of uh, Prussian, Prussia right before World War One.
Hmm.
Because they're drawn from a huge mix of influences, not understanding all the context of all of them. So I didn't want to say, oh, this is obviously this.
Right.
And there have been a lot of nomadic warrior groups throughout history,
Hmm.
and badgers pull from all of them, even some fictional ones.
Like the
Um, uh,
Dothraki.
right, yeah, there's a little bit of Dothraki, there's a little bit of Klingon in there,
Yeah.
to be honest. Uh, um, So I mean, I've not been shy about pulling from fictionalized or pop culture versions of cultures.
Yeah,
Obviously, for legal reasons, I can't directly call on some pop culture
right.
cultures, but I mean, I can kind of nudge and wink towards them. Again, like with pirates, Pugmire is a good example. We actually had a discussion about whether we should call them pirates or not, and I finally realized we call historical aquatic adventurers pirates. That's just the word we use now. So they would use that word because that's the
Hmm.
word we use. So even though pirate really meant to be criminals,
Right.
that's not what we use the term for anymore. So I just didn't bother and moved on with my life.
Yeah, and like even when we do, it's still like kind of a fun thing to be for a lot of people.
Yep.
And so yeah, we just figured that the term, by the time it got passed down to the animals of Pugmire, it would just become like pirate just means seafarer, like
Right.
person who goes on sea adventures, because
Yep.
maybe they found some references to pirate in some weird old recording, and they were like, hey, we could do that.
Right, because they're going to look at historical references, they're going to look at Treasure Islands, they're going to look at Pirates of the Caribbean, and they're going to go, this is all the same thing.
Mm-hmm. They're gonna find the broken down animatronics from Pirates of the Caribbean.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so there's the person who asked that question said, to be fair, Klingon and Dothraki also pull a fair bit from the Mongols. So yeah,
Sure.
didn't mean it's a one-to-one, more like a like quick reference. And then Travis pointed out, so similar to how a lot of folks say Viking, but are not referring to the job position,
Right.
because being a Vikinger was a thing you were.
Right.
But now we just look back at a certain history of Scandinavian peoples, and we're like Vikings, all of them.
Sure. Yeah, but to address the point, like again, if it helps you or your group to kind
Yeah,
of get to that mindset, that's fine. I am always reluctant to take an entire real world culture, historical or modern, and say, oh, it's just like that because it others that culture and also
yeah.
reduces them. And I don't think that's fair or very nice.
However,
So
as a quick reference with the Badger King unifying the tribes, it does make some sense. You can
sure.
also look at a lot of Native American tribes for that, a lot of indigenous
Right.
peoples.
Yep. Hmm.
There like the Mohawk Nation was
Yep.
huge, and and there's quite a few na- Native tribes who had that kind of situation going on, where there were a bunch of different tribes united under like kind of main like one
Right.
main thing.
And similar, there were First Nation tribes who attacked Western outposts
Mm-hmm.
because they needed food or resources and whatnot. And that's where this kind of myth of the quote unquote Red Indian kind of came from, was these very desperate tribes who had to make very desperate moves.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so there's a lot of real world things you can draw from. It's not necessarily just as one place.
Yeah, I mean it's happened a lot over the course of the history of the continent of Africa as well.
Yep, that's true.
So there's definitely lots of things you can look at. So yes, anytime that a tribal people come together for a common cause is a good way to think of the Badgers.
Yep.
It's happened a lot throughout history, and it makes sense it would happen with them because they're tribal, they're a bit nomadic, they rarely stay in one place, and having a strong leader who actually has a vision for where they're going to go moving forward is interesting. But
Hmm.
of course, they're also not all going to agree with him. They don't
Exactly.
have to. Like, I mean, gosh, look at pretty much every power faction in Game of Thrones, not just the Dothraki,
Yep.
but the way that like everybody who has a king they're dealing with either agrees with or doesn't agree with them. And how all the different people north of the wall have their own tribal customs and things, and they don't want to deal with this. And so like, there's so many touchstones for this, both fictional and non.
Right.
Like Eddie said, so you have lots of things to pull from.
Yep.
And yes, yeah, someone just said the wildlings, which I was just kind of like trying to remember their name. I was
Right.
like,
Yes.
people north of the wall. Like, I know what I
Those
mean.
people, stuff,
Um,
Northlings.
yeah, exactly. We have another question. What happened to the rodents' lost city? Which that might be a question like humans, but is it going to come back in 2E as far as just like references to
Probably.
it?
I mean, when I get to the Squeaks and Deep thing, I'll probably talk more about that. But it is. I'm glad you mentioned that because it is kind of the same vein in the sense that it makes more sense as a mythological allegory than a real place.
Hmm.
Because as soon as you say, "Oh yeah, your city, it's Atlanta, it's over there, go get it," then it stops losing all power as a myth.
Right.
But having the rodents confused and argue about whether it existed and where it's at and which one is the city, and having multiple people maybe think that multiple cities were the lost city, that's the more interesting setting component. So that myth of the lost city will probably come back. I don't see a reason why I'd get rid of it. But in terms of saying, "Oh yeah, no, it's here are the coordinates for it," that's probably never going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, like especially if you look at kind of the various animal tropes that we lean on for a lot of these. Like cats can
Hmm.
argue theology about whether or not they have 9 lives.
Yep.
Dogs can argue about man and what man wanted and what it means to serve man.
Hmm.
Um, not in the Twilight Zone episode way.
I was just thinking that it's to
Um,
serve man.
but also like, birds have their like mythological place in the sky they go to when they die, but maybe there actually is a sky kingdom. I don't know. It's
Right.
way in the future. There could be like a spaceship up there the birds go live on after a while. I don't know. And then same thing with uh, mice and rats. Like their whole thing, especially in Realms of Pugmire, is that they're displaced. They're not.
Hmm.
They don't have a homeland anymore. They might have a
Right.
village they grew up in, but they don't have anything near the scale of like Pugmire or even one of the monarchies.
Yep.
And so for them, the biggest like pie in the sky wish would be to have that. And maybe
Right.
at some point they have to reestablish it. That could also be a really interesting story if you wanted to run one of these kind of big spanning things. It's like,
But
do
but
they find their own kingdom or not?
right. But again, I mean, I'm typing into this kind of the diasporic
Mm-hmm.
people, the culture of them, and it's like for a lot of Jewish people, it's Jerusalem. For a lot of Irish people, it's Ireland. This idea there's
Mm-hmm.
this land that may exist, but is also to a certain degree mythical to them, is important to them. And the fact that it exists is almost secondary to the fact that their identity needs to have some land that we came from.
Mm-hmm.
So, I again, like having a see, you just kind of go back to and then just sell down and be fine with, or even see that objectively, okay, it's officially lost and we will never go back. Both of those don't work really well. It makes more sense that the idea of this could exist and we could go back there, but maybe just not today. Really plays into the identity of these kinds of people more effectively.
Mm-hmm. I just had like a violent flashback to a Winnie the Pooh episode that I had
That
not thought
is not
about.
a sentence I expected to hear today.
There's an episode of the Winnie the Pooh cartoon that was on when I was a kid, where there's like I guess small piglets, and they think that Piglet is their king, and they live in the land of milk and honey. And I just remember all of them chanting "the land of milk and honey, the land of milk and honey," and it reminded me of like the Rat King or anything else that like mice could chant.
I, what you're telling me is that I really need to rewatch the Winnie the Pooh show because apparently it was deeply weird in a way I didn't
It
realize.
was, it was, it was very strange. I definitely cartoons were weird in the late 80s and early
Oh yeah.
90s, like
Oh
way more
yeah.
than, I mean, like now they're weird, but they're like purposefully weird. Like Adventure
Right.
Time is weird for reasons, or
Right.
Steven Universe is weird for reasons. I feel like some of the ones that we watched back in the day were just weird because people were on cocaine. Like, I don't know.
It's like I need to write a script in one weekend and I had nothing but coffee.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know?
So here's tiny, tiny pigs chanting.
Right.
Yeah, cool. So we are getting like the last, 10 minutes or so here. So if anybody has one more question, I can probably slide one more in. But is there anything
Yeah.
else you wanted to talk about, Eddie, while you have the floor of the stage? Also, you're doing some upcoming things too, if you want to talk about
Yeah,
those.
yeah. We it's not official yet, but we are shooting for sometime before the end of January having our Kickstarter. So it's going to happen pretty soon. So get ready for it. It's possible things may shift a little bit, but really, I would really like to have it started before the end of the month because that would make things life a lot easier for me.
Mm-hmm.
But outside of this, going forward, every time at the 2 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock GMT, I'm going to be on the Onyx Path Discord. I'm going to pop into one of the channels and just do a quick kind of short another Q&A, or I'll talk about a short topic. So it's a chance to kind of hang out with me. It'll be 15, 20 minutes. It'll be pretty fast. But it's hey, I'm talking about random character creation, or I want to talk about the Badgers or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be whatever is on my mind that day. So feel free to come by, hang out again like this, ask questions if you have to. They don't have to be on the topic. It could be about anything. Um, uh, and just kind of get everyone ready for it. The what's coming up because I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, and hopefully, depending on travel schedules and things. But right now, we have planned for whenever we do launch the Kickstarter to do like a little cool countdown show for it.
Yeah.
Play some Jackbox maybe, do some audience participation stuff. Because that'll be fun. We were probably going to make a Pugmire specific Jackbox pack for a couple of them.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So,
need to get back to you on that. Yeah.
yeah, it'll be fun though. So yeah,
Yeah.
so that's definitely the plan for all those.
Yeah, and so if that goes out well, the idea is that we'll do like an hour beforehand, do a kind of countdown, then So in the first hour, watching the numbers go up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, who doesn't want to watch numbers go up?
Right? Numbers are great.
Numbers go up. Numbers go brr. Stonks.
Stonks.
Stonks. Okay, it looks like we're winding down here, so let's go ahead and wind it down. And this is really great, though, everybody. Like, wonderful
Yeah.
questions, people. Like, I am
I
very,
was
very
actually,
pleased.
when we first talked about this, I was like, maybe we'll have enough questions for half an hour or so. And I know I asked you to prepare questions, and we didn't hardly use any of them.
Mm-hmm. Someone did ask if Candace Minor was open to 2E prior to public release. Not usually.
No,
Generally, we don't open it until the book is actually out to the public, so out at
right,
like two retailers.
right, because we want people to be able to buy the book and then immediately be able to buy Canis Minor stuff. They buy Canis Minor stuff and go, oh, but this doesn't work with the one ebook I have. That's just going to cause problems. So,
Exactly. So it'll be allowed when that book is out.
yep,
That's been our thing with pretty much everything that we've released as far as things that have Story Path Nexus or Canis Minor
yep,
content. So yeah, thank you for the question though.
no problem.
Yeah. So where can people find you or talk to you? I know it's like right under your face. So
Under my face. But if you want to know more about Pugmire, realmspugmire.com is my website. And so when the Kickstarter goes live, I'll have a link there. And you can buy all the 1E stuff there, as well as some of the non-Onyx Path Pugmire stuff that I've done.
mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, pugsteady.com is where you can find me, or on the Onyx Path Discord, like I said.
Yeah, Discord's the best place to talk to either of us in real time, honestly,
Yep.
because we're often there. It's like during the day, especially, because we both do try to keep normal-ish work hours.
Right.
Although I often pop on at like 11 p.m. and yell at people, so you know who knows. You can find me pretty much everywhere at Dixie Cyanide. You can find the Onyx Path everywhere at the Onyx Path. That's where you are right now on Twitch.tv/Onyx Path. That's also our Twitter, website, all that kind of stuff. So definitely check out everything we've been doing. Check out the Kickstarter when it pops up, and if you want to chat with Eddy a little bit, the next few days at 2 p.m., Eddy will be hanging out in Discord,
Indeed, I will.
and I will be leaving him on his own. He will have no moderation.
Uh, Abandoned.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for tuning in, and if you're watching this on VOD, thank you for catching up with it. Have a good one.
Bye bye.